So now it's my pleasure to introduce three speakers who will be combining to give us some information about the future of clean meat. First is Natalie Cargill. She graduated with a first-class degree from the University of Oxford and worked as a project officer for an effective global health charity. Since training as a lawyer, Natalie has worked for Sentience Politics in Berlin and now practices as a barrister in London. She is especially interested in effective interventions to promote anti-speciesism. Please welcome Natalie Cargill.
Thank you.
Alex Foster is next. He was trained as an engineer and was keen to build dams in Africa until he switched to earning to give. He started his first business in university building apps for people and later went on to grow a machine learning business to over $1 million a year. He capped his salary a long time ago and couldn't be happier about it, and in his spare time he helps grow EA as much as possible and still has been making some good progress in HNW Philanthropic Advisory. Please welcome Alex Foster. And finally, Seren Kell just graduated from her master's in biochemistry from Oxford, during which she undertook research into the fundamental mechanisms underlying the process of aging. Alongside her studies, she led and participated in a number of EA-related projects. Please welcome Seren Kell. All right, guys, on the future of clean meat, take it away.
So clean meat has received a huge amount of hype recently, in recent years and in recent months especially. And as good effective altruists, you want to know, should I believe the hype? Well, as this is an effective altruism conference, unfortunately, I can't give you a 100% definitive answer on anything. Certainly not that. And I'm not here to pitch clean meat. What we intend to give you, however, is the best information and the best numbers we have on clean meat and the questions that you should be thinking about if you want to know whether or not to believe the hype. So the best things come in threes, like Destiny's Child and two other things. So I'll be giving an overview of why the conventional meat industry is broken, how the clean meat industry could be great, and the things we need to think about. I'll then pass you on to Alex, who will focus specifically on how clean meat can be cost competitive with conventional meat. That is a breakdown of every element in the stage of the clean meat process, what it currently costs, and what it would need to cost in order to be price competitive. And then what you really came for is Seren, who will give you an overview of the science at each stage of the clean meat process, what that involves, how it needs to be improved, and who can work to improve it. So, Winston Churchill, who very kindly provided a quote to any lecturer on any given topic that they wish to speak about, had this to say about clean meat in 1932. So he predicted in 1932 that in 50 years, we shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order to eat the breast or wing by growing these parts separately under a suitable medium. Now, with probably no intention to do so whatsoever, he had a really great point. First of all, the conventional meat industry is indeed absurd. It's absurd in the cruelty that it inflicts on billions of animals, in the damage it does to our environment, and in the huge threat that it poses to global health. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these numbers, and I don't need to read them out to you now, but the essential point is that factory farming, intensive factory farming, is the single biggest cause of human inflicted suffering in the world. And that's wrong, and we should try and stop that. And to get on board with trying to stop that, you don't need to wholeheartedly endorse anti-speciesism. You don't need to think that animals suffer in the same way that humans suffer. You don't even need to be completely sure that animals do suffer. There's room for some uncertainty, but given the scope and the numbers at stake, that uncertainty can be outweighed. You just simply need to believe that needless cruelty is wrong, and we should try and stop it. So from an environmental perspective, the meat industry is a ticking time bomb, essentially. Meat consumption is set to double or more than double by 2050. And the current state of affairs is that the meat industry produces more greenhouse gas emissions than every motor vehicle in the world combined. It takes up a ridiculous amount of space. There will simply be no more room to continue farming in the way that we're farming very soon. It's incredibly inefficient, and it causes huge amounts of water pollution, as well as greenhouse gas pollution. So if we care about the environment, one of the best things we can do is work to end factory farming and work really hard to do that, and perhaps work less hard to bring our own bags to the supermarkets, for example. In terms of human health, as the demand for meat increases, factory farming methods are likely to become ever more intensive, and we're getting closer and closer to the next swine flu, bird flu, the next mad cow disease. It's a really huge threat to human health. And on top of that, not only creating diseases will be easier, but treating diseases will be harder. 80% of the antibiotics in the US are used on farm animals, and they're used at subtherapeutic doses in their food every time they're fed, because the conditions are so ripe for disease that these measures have to be taken. But the unfortunate consequence of that is that antibiotics will no longer work. This is all looking pretty bad. So could clean meat be the answer? Well, if it works out, it looks very promising. No need for slaughter, far lower land use, far less water use, far lower greenhouse gas emissions, essentially eliminate the risk of disease, and people can finally stop asking vegetarians where they get their protein from. So a number of benefits. But as effective altruists, we're not just interested in saying clean meat would be really great and conventional meat is really terrible, which may well be the case. The fundamental question is this a product that can come to market within a viable time frame at a reasonably cost-competitive price that people will buy such that it's an effective thing to either work in or to fund? And that's the question we're trying to answer. And here are the key questions that we would need to look at in order to work towards an answer. I think fundamentally there's a much broader key question of how much you value animal welfare and how much you value interventions to improve that compared to, say, far future causes or compared to, say, global health. But that's beyond the scope of this presentation, and we'd really invite you to come and talk to us about that if you'd like to. But just focusing on clean meat as a viable product, we need to know whether there's going to be enough funding for research, whether there are going to be people qualified and willing and able to do that research. And then at each stage in the process, we'll go through the process with Alex and Seren, but at each stage in that process, can we make the breakthroughs that we need to really push this ahead to be something that can be done at scale? Will it be cost competitive? I've directed people to a couple of articles to read on the last two questions, as we're not covering them today. And if it all works out, will people actually buy it? And will they eat it? And again, there have been some studies on this that do look hopeful, but these are very early results. So with that, I will hand you over to Alex, who's going to take you through in detail the cost breakdown of clean and conventional meat. Thank you.
Great. So we say in detail, but really what we're going to look at is it's a highly simplified model that we can use to sort of play around with some ideas. We know that there's a number of things that could stop clean meat from working. And talking about the consumer or regulatory acceptance deserves an entire talk in itself, as does will we ever get the sort of taste that we're looking for? Will it ever be a suitable replacement product? For the purposes of the rest of this talk, we're just going to look at cost. Meat production requires around 9 calories for every 1 calorie that ends up being eaten by a human, mostly because you need to grow food for the animals, and they're not very efficient at converting that into muscle. This results in, I don't know if you've ever heard someone say, we don't have enough room in the world to have more meat production. This always seemed very surprising to me, because I thought, well, animals aren't that big, and I've seen loads of empty fields that I'm sure we could use. The reason for this is that it's estimated around 70% of today's arable land is actually used for feeding animals, and it's really more of a restriction on the amount of arable land we could possibly grow than anything else. The amount of meat demand globally is expected to double by around 2050, and we don't have 40% more arable land. So that's a big driver in terms of where we expect demand to come from the conventional market. Now, it seems very intuitive that a big factor would be whether we can reach cost competitiveness. It would turn an altruistic venture into a highly profitable market, one that we would sort of expect to grow by itself, assuming that it had acceptance. So we're just going to focus on that for the sake of this part of the talk. So today, the cost of buying 1 kilogram of beef is about $6.50. If we bake in some additional margin, say 15%, and we associate sort of 20% distribution costs, this means that the price we're trying to beat, and this is the one right at the bottom, is sort of around $4.50. And so this is one way in which potentially we could get to a point where it costs less than that. But that is a really, really low number. And the meat industry has had effectively a 200-year head start in mass-producing meat and working out how to do it very effectively, and we have to play catch-up, which is very challenging. One final addenda before I jump into this a bit more is that we don't currently have any feasible way of growing steaks, sort of growing whole pieces of meat, like how you might think of it. We're only talking about ground meat. We grow cells, and those cells end up being meat, but not in the same shape and sort of structure that you would call a steak. So where are we at today? So the cheapest anyone has produced meat at the moment is thought to be something like $10,000 a kilogram. But a year ago, it was $100,000 a kilogram, and a year before that, it was about $1 million a kilogram. So the real question is that trend going to continue, or are we walking into diminishing returns? Is there any major breakthroughs required that will require more than 10 years for us to get there? I'm not going to be able to answer that question, but what we can do is walk through some of the steps. So super simple way of thinking about clean meat, and this is very, very simplistic, so if you guys know anything about it, I'm sorry if this offends you. But effectively, you get some starter cells, generally stem cells, and you put them in a tank. In the tank, you put some food for those cells, and you put something in there that allows you to remove the sort of waste products of those cells. You effectively then let the cells grow by themselves. And in theory, that's the very simplified way of how it works. In reality, these things become complicated. Cells tend to die, they don't tend to keep duplicating forever, and they often end up as not the cell you were intending. You often grow stem cells, and they end up as sort of fat cells or something. So running through this, let's say we start with a tank volume of sort of a big tank, so it's like 25,000 liters, and we manage to get to some aggressive cell density. This is sort of one of the key items that you'd be thinking about if you were trying to make this market-worthy. If you've got a big tank, what percentage of that tank is going to end up filled with cells when you're done? At the moment, this is very, very low, because it's actually quite hard to get cells to live in tanks in the first place. Seren will go through this. But also, they tend to kill themselves and come back, like basically conflict with each other. But let's say we can get to 20%, which is actually a very aggressive number. And then let's say that gets us sort of 4 tons of cells, and that should be fine. The costs of the actual cells, and this is the 2 bottom bits, should be relatively low, because if you have like an infinite stream of initial cells, and that's what we expect to be getting to, that just shouldn't cost that much. What's going to cost a lot is this media component. Now, Seren will take us through what that actually is, but effectively it's the food, it's the goo that you put your cells in to make them grow. And at the moment, this is outrageously expensive. It has a number of things in it that lead to it being very expensive. But you have to fill the tank with it, you have to replace it several times, and these costs, even at R&D stage, are proving to be very, very expensive. But we project them to still be one of the most expensive components in the future. We want to get down to a point where we have sort of only a few cycles of media, so we're not changing the tank many times a day for a month, but we're getting down to a much smaller number. And we want to get down to the point where the initial cost of media is very low. At the moment, serum-free media costs sort of around $400 for a liter, and for us to get anywhere near something that's feasible, we really need something more like $1 a liter or $0.50 a liter. And Seren will look into that. There's then one final component, which is then media recycling. which is a promising thing that's looking like it should work, where instead of changing the media over every single time, we're able to just sort of recycle it. We get rid of the waste, we put more nutrients in, and we put it back in. And so yeah, on a very simple level, if we can meet these targets, it should work, and if we can't, we need a completely new approach, and realistically, this will never be cost competitive. So this hopefully gives us something to work from. I'll hand over to Seren.
Cool. So with this in mind, I'll go through each of the stages which need to be improved and talk about what actually needs to change in order to reach the kinds of numbers that we saw on the previous slide. So we'll start off with the cell line. In a dream world, we would have an established cell line that can replicate very quickly. This would mean that we could start off with, say, 10 tons of cells, we wait for them to double, and then we remove 10 tons in order to differentiate them into the muscle cells. Thus, by skimming off the tail end of an exponential curve over and over, we could be growing animal cells far quicker and cheaper than animals ever could. No brains, no bones, using a 3-dimensional space, and hopefully 0 animal suffering. In order to get to this point, we need to develop both an immortal and a stable cell line. Immortality is key. Cells don't replicate indefinitely, instead halting after a certain number of divisions. This is for good reason. They don't want to become cancerous, and there are a host of overlapping mechanisms in place in order to ensure that this is the case. However, for clean meat, we need to convince them to replicate indefinitely. This can be done through brute force. For example, if we replicate a sufficient number of cells over and over, one of them will develop this attribute randomly, but we can speed this up, namely through using genetic engineering. Stability is also key. The genomes of cells aren't always replicated 100% faithfully when they divide. Instead, their behavior or their nature could change drastically over many generations. This is great for evolution, really bad for clean meat. Once we understand our cells, we don't want them potentially altering drastically over what could be unlimited generations. We also need to think about the cell type we want to start with our 3 primary options being myosatellite cells, embryonic stem cells, and induced pluripotent stem cells. Myosatellite cells can be taken from the relevant animal, presumably by a harmless biopsy, and the advantage of these cells over the other cell types is that they may potentially be easier to differentiate into the muscle cells we're after. Embryonic stem cells can proliferate much more easily than the myosatellite cells, but there are potentially regulatory issues which come with these cells, and it may be more difficult to persuade them to turn into the types of cells that we want to turn them into. Finally, induced pluripotent stem cells, which are what won John Gurdon and Shimyu Yamanaka the Nobel Prize in 2012, provide a potential compromise between the above 2 cell types, but these have to be induced through genetic engineering, which of course leads to the great question, do we GM or do we not GM? If we play with the potential genome of our cell line, we could solve the above issues and other ones. For example, we could insert a gene for telomerase, which could convince our cells to become immortal, or we could even re-engineer entire cellular metabolic pathways, which would reduce the need for them to rely on expensive growth factors to proliferate. As you can imagine, there would be obvious controversy associated with this. Growing mammalian cells at industrial scales in huge bioreactors is understandably a relatively novel pursuit. This is because it's usually limited to medical and research applications, which happen at a much lower scale and don't need to compete with the cost of standard meat production. With this in mind, there are a huge number of changes which need to happen to optimize for cost-effective scale-up, and I'll just list a few of these. First of all, we would need to develop a low-cost method of maintaining sterility and optimize mixing of the media in the bioreactors so as to reduce shear stress of the cells. We could optimize bioreactor intelligence, including ways to live monitor not only the pH and temperature of the solution, but also the various ratios of the components inside and the cell density. The last of these is particularly important. There is a Goldilocks zone for cell density, wherein if they're too close together, they stop dividing, but they don't want to be too far apart from one another because they still like to talk to one another. For differentiation, scaffolds need to provide nerve-like stimulation and work the muscle in order to induce protein synthesis. We need to develop scaffolds which can do this and then allow for easy harvesting of the cells from the scaffolds unless we make the scaffolds edible, which is also an alternative. Cell culture media. This is potentially the lowest hanging fruit. Most people doing cell culture use media which contains fetal bovine serum, which, as the name suggests, is not vegan. In fact, it would probably take 1 to 3 whole cow fetuses in order to produce 1 kilogram of whole, clean meat. Not only this, but there's a higher chance of contamination when using fetal bovine serum, and also a potential batch-by-batch variability, meaning clean meat companies wouldn't actually be the only people to benefit from moving away from its use. However, as Alex mentioned, media which is serum-free is currently incredibly expensive. It is thought that in order to make clean meat cost competitive, we'll have to reduce its cost down to $1 per litre or less. One current company, which is pretty representative of current serum-free formulations, charges $418 per litre. There are some straightforward immediate cost reductions which can be undertaken. For example, basal media, which is the non-serum component of the media, is currently sold at unbelievably huge margins, meaning if we only bulk bought these components and mixed it together ourselves, you could reduce the cost down a good 90%. But this would still leave the total cost of media at a prohibitive price. Beyond that, there are a number of options that we have. We could bulk produce the serum components of the media, for example, by putting the genes in yeast and growing them as recombinant proteins at a huge scale. This, in combination with bulk buying the media components, could bring the cost to 85 cents per litre or less. Alternatively, we could find small molecule replacements for the growth factors, for example, through synthesizing them chemically, which is possible if they are just small peptidomimetics of the growth factors themselves. We could also use non-animal-based ingredients, such as mushroom or plant extracts, though this is potentially more difficult because the whole search space is the plant kingdom, and we have to go looking for similar molecules, and there is also the potential for these components to be allergenic. Finally, and this could be used in conjunction with the above methods, there is the potential for media recycling, as Alex mentioned. This seems easy in concept, but it would require an ability to monitor both the waste coming out of the bioreactors and purify it in order to actually recycle the media. So, will this work? Honestly, it's very hard to say. We know it's possible to produce clean meat. We don't know whether we can get the cost down in a sufficient time frame. It's worth bearing in mind, however, that many now everyday items used to be obscenely expensive prior to certain technological breakthroughs. These include computers, the internet, Velcro, freeze-dried foods, and only after the technological breakthroughs took place could we actually get these out mass-produced for ordinary people. Like clean meat, a lot of these were initially developed for space and defense projects. There are reasons to be optimistic that the relevant breakthroughs will take place in the context of clean meat. This is especially so since there are a rapidly increasing rate in improvements in bioscience due to improvements in sequencing, knowledge of the relevant pathways taking place in the organisms, in silico modeling systems for the organisms, and synthetic biology to actually modify them. Finally, the people who we believe best placed to probably work on this include biochemists and tissue culture specialists in order to better understand cellular behavior and improve the rate at which they can grow in bioreactors, engineers, including chemical and biological engineers, to help improve the scale-up of bioreactor systems, and finally, nutritional scientists who would have a sense of what products need to be added to the clean meat in order to make it taste good. Thank you.
Just one last, I've got a mic. And just one last interesting point before we take questions. Since about 3 years ago when the first hamburger was created, there's been a lot of question marks in terms of how fast things are going to go. But over the summer, we had one of the strongest signals we've had yet in terms of the financing perspective, where we saw a company called Memphis Meats raise $17 million from one of the top VCs in the world, the FJ, Richard Branson, Bill Gates, and most interestingly, a company called Cargill. Cargill is one of the largest meat companies in the world, and they chose to invest in that round, suggesting that they at least were taking it seriously. This doesn't really give us that much information, but from a financing perspective, it's a very strong signal. So I'd love to take your questions. All right, you can ask your questions, submit your questions via the Bizzabo app or via the web at london.eaglobal.org/polls. One more time, for those who aren't sick of it yet, london.eaglobal.org/polls. So we've already got a handful of questions in, and I'm sure there will be a lot more coming. Great talk, thank you guys. A couple of questions about the political economy of all of this. You mentioned GMOs, obviously a highly stigmatized technology that people don't know a lot about, but feel very strongly about nonetheless. What are the odds that clean meat, cultured meat, ends up there, and how do we make sure that that does not happen?
Cool. Do you want to go?
Yeah, I can have a go. Yeah, it's tricky. So, for context, in Europe, GMs are basically illegal, whereas in other places they're not. Basically everywhere in the world they have some major stigma attached to them. And they don't have a huge amount of scientific backing to suggest that they should have a major amount of stigma attached to them. So the question mark here is, if that happened for GM, why couldn't it happen for clean meat, even if there was no particular issue with it? This is a really difficult question. The guys who are looking into it the most thoroughly are a group called GFI, Good Food Institute. This has basically been put together by the vegan mafia, so to speak. And it's a group that are scientists and researchers looking into how do we make sure that both, specifically clean meat, but also plant-based meat, has a positive trajectory, that we don't fall into some of the problems. Now, one of the best breakthroughs they've had so far is actually the word clean meat, because before they were put together, it was referred to as in vitro meat, which you have a similar intuition to me that has a much larger chance of becoming a taboo under that name. But yeah, no definite answers. It seems like if we don't use any GM at all, that greatly reduces our chances of getting where we want to go, but it also increases the risk later down the line. So there's a lot of conversations at the moment around this sort of trade-off. Do we increase the speed, or do we and increase the risk later on, or do we go much slower and see where it gets us?
Can I add, I think there's also scope for the traditional animal advocacy community to make people aware of the way in which conventional meat is produced. Because people sometimes think, oh gosh, this strange lab meat, isn't that unnatural? But the way in which we're eating meat now is insanely unnatural and is pumped full of antibiotics and is made in, awful conditions. And people eat meat in spite of how it's produced, but we would like them to eat it sort of because of how it's produced.
I will just add on top of that with regard to the GM. I think it's very relevant where we're doing the GM in the process. So if you're actually altering the genome of the cell line itself, that will probably be far more difficult to get people on board than if you're doing, for example, what I was saying with the media, where if you produce recombinant proteins in organisms such as yeast at high scale and then use those proteins to feed to the cells, that would probably be okay, given a lot of huge companies do this already and they don't necessarily have to label it as GM. For example, Unilever put the gene, it was an antifreeze protein, which they took from a fish called the Pacific flounder fish, I think, and they expressed it in yeast at high quantities, put it in all their ice cream because it makes it taste better, and they could put less cream in it, and it's therefore less calories. I think they don't label that as GM, it's ice structuring protein. So it depends where we're actually doing the modification, because that would affect things like regulation and perception, I think.
Picking up just on the question of, is it feasible to do this without any sort of GM along the way? I mean, obviously, as you said, there's different kind of stages in the chain, but it seems like it will be a heck of a lot easier to do it if we can use kind of the full range of tools at our disposal. Do you think there's really much plausible chance that this goes forward without any GM in the final product?
So what seems really likely is that groups like GFI are really pushing for there to be lots of companies working on this. And one of the reasons is for this sort of reason, that if you have some companies that embrace GM and go like, great, let's use it for everything, some people who only use it, like Seren mentions, to basically use GM to build things that grow things rather than actually designing the cells themselves, and people who don't at all, if there's a regulatory issue around the GM problem, or it looks like the studies are suggesting that using GM is going to cause acceptance issues, one company can basically have its funding pulled away, and the other companies can have more pumped into them. It gives us flexibility to move. What the answer is, I think, is really difficult to know. What's important is that we have our bases covered.
So a lot of great questions here. I'll try to cover as many as we can. On price, your premise essentially is it needs to be cost competitive. One person asks, would it be possible to think of clean meat as a premium product in some way and compete with sort of the high end of the market, or really get maybe a superior taste or a superior mix of fat to muscle tissue or something along those lines that means it's not purely a cost play?
Yeah. Do I review?
I would just say it's an option for some people if they want to produce something which they think people will buy because it's a premium product. Whether meat grown in labs would be seen as a premium product, I don't know. They'd have to find out if they think that they could market it as such.
I mean, the numbers we had up there were they're very rough cost estimates based on what we have confidence in that is supposedly possible, if that is well hedged enough. So the existing theories of how it's going to work as we move along, if those work out, those are the sorts of numbers we might get to. But it currently relies on all of those working. Let's say we do a premium good, you might be looking at sort of twice the cost or 5 times the cost, but you tweak any of those numbers and your costs sort of fly around in orders of magnitude. So I think it's very likely that we go premium first, but it sort of assumes that the end of the diminishing returns is sort of as coming into play around that point, and I think it could come into play well below it, and this won't work, or it could come in well above it, and suddenly you have the cheapest ground meat in the world. Really key point, though, is that we are producing ground meat, and producing premium ground meat is tricky, because you're basically, it's mince, it's meatballs, and it's chicken nuggets.
I think you covered this a little bit, but what is the price today, and is there any place in the world where it's at all commercialized? At any price, can I go buy a clean meat burger in today's world?
No.
Short answer.
So it's for context. The first one that was built, it was for a contest held by Larry Page, who basically said, "I will pay $1 million to the man who grows me a hamburger." And a guy in the Netherlands, I think, he grew it in flasks. So basically, like en masse, the way you would do R&D experiments, like little dishes and things. Which is, I've heard stories of his lab just completely covered in these things everywhere. No part of that resembles scale. No part of that is feasible in terms of growing it up. He was just sort of gunning for it so that he could win this prize. The more recent numbers are coming out of bioreactors, but companies are being relatively secretive as to sort of how exactly they're doing it. But bioreactors weren't even possible 5 years ago. And Seren can say something. I mean, mammalian cells, in theory, you put them in a bioreactor and they die. So that was one of the first improvements to cell lines that people started making.
So you mentioned chicken nuggets for a second. So one person asks, why all the focus on beef? Is there something about beef that's easier? Is it just sort of a fetish of the meat industry to focus on beef first? Obviously, I think the consensus in the EA community is that the welfare of chickens is the most problematic of all the animals. So where does chicken fit into this?
So I think given the case that the first product will most likely be a ground meat product, it won't be a whole complicated tissue structure with vessels and kind of fat deposits and whatever. If it is going to be a ground meat product, ground beef is a much higher market than ground chicken or ground pork or ground turkey. They occupy like less than 10% of those animal markets, whereas ground beef, I think, is nearing 50% of the market of beef sales.
Gotcha.
An additional point also, so this point has actually come up quite a bit, and so there is now significant focus on chicken. So Hampton Creek, who are this billion-dollar producer of plant-based mayonnaise and other things, they have a clean meat lab. They have decided they're going to put loads of resources into it, and they've been focusing primarily on chicken, but also there is a group in Israel that have been getting quite a bit of funding who are focusing on chicken as well. There's also one company that's sort of trying to look at, doing all kinds of animals. And there's this theory that is basically, if it's a mammal and it's got cells, it's going to be relatively similar to another mammal when you're taking the cell. Like, it's such a big jump to have a cell growing in a body to growing it in a tank that if we're able to do that for one animal, it shouldn't be that much of a leap to do it for another. And so if you throw this argument to someone who's focusing on growing beef cells, they'll say, well, we'll do beef first, and then we'll spend a year and we'll do chicken a year later.
So you mentioned Hampton Creek. There's a question specifically about Hampton Creek. Apparently they're on record saying that they're going to be selling clean burgers and nuggets at the end of 2018. At least that's what the questioner reports.